Thank you. Hello, everybody. Just going to get my screen. I'm going to just thank you very much for inviting me today. I am Jessica Dine. I'm a pulmonologist, and I'm the Associate Dean of Assessment now at the Perlman School of Medicine at Penn, which is usually a mouthful to say. And I'm honored that you invited me to talk about evaluating the clerkship as part of your developmental series. Before I dive in, I'll just remind you that there's CME credits, 1 credit. Since this education is non-clinical, we don't have to go through disclosures, but I have no disclosures relevant to the talk anyway. And as you know, the series is a 3-year series where you have 9 webinars a year, the second Thursday of every month, and it's based on the guidebook of clerkship directors. And here's the series 101 that has already occurred, and as I understand, is available on the website of previous recordings. And now we're in the middle of series 201, and you can see here the next 3 topics, and then after that you'll move on to series 301, and here are the topics listed. But I was asked today to talk about evaluating the clerkship, and before I dive in, I have to tell you that Nadia Bennett, Judy Shea, and Jen Kogan were the original authors of the chapter I was asked to speak about, but they couldn't be here today, so they asked me to fill in for them, and they're all incredible, so I hope to do them justice. So before I jump in, I would love to hear from all of you about what you hope to learn about evaluating the clerkship. And if you don't mind unmuting yourself and just chiming in, because I can't see the chat.
Jessica, this is Lou Pangaro. I'm interested in what we know about the cost benefit of evaluation, how much money, how much resources needs to go into this. I find that in my own school and other places, LCME, others want you to do all this, but they have no idea of how much it takes. So I'm interested in that question, resources. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you. Anyone else have any goals that you'd like to get out of this? Otherwise, just interrupt me as I speak, and we can steer in a different direction than what I will go if I'm not meeting one of your objectives. So before I start, any other objectives or any other goals you'd like to hear about? All right, well, let's see if what I came up with meets your objectives. So what I wanted to talk about today is to try to use some program evaluation models that might be relevant to how you want to evaluate your clerkship. And I hope that it will encompass the cost-benefit ratio of the resources that you have available and what should you actually do to meet the outcomes and the evaluations of your clerkship. And then hopefully while we talk about it, I'll leave you with some practical steps on how you can actually use one of these program evaluation models to have an ongoing and cyclic program evaluation model. So if you don't mind sharing with me, what do you think is going well right now with evaluating your clerkships? You guys are a quiet group. Sometimes it's easier to talk about what isn't working well. Anybody want to share that? If not, I'll tell you what my clerkship directors told me.
I think one thing I should introduce myself. I'm Kate Gibson from USC, Keck Medical School. And one thing that I have found has worked well is I feel we have pretty good evaluations of our didactics from our students. And the evaluations perhaps from their sites is not as robust or as helpful.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I've heard that as well. Anyone else have any comments about what is working or what isn't working well? So in preparation for this talk, I asked my clerkship directors if they wouldn't mind sharing with me what they think is working well and what isn't working well. And here's what they came up with. So very similar to what Karen was just saying, is that they thought that the student satisfaction portion of particular components of the clerkship, especially didactics, was going really well. Like they got a lot of feedback about those. They also said that they have good student outcomes data that is already being collected elsewhere, and we can come back to that. But for example, the shelf exams. And they were also getting external data, like some of the AAMC survey results that was relevant to their clerkship, and I'll review that as well. But exactly what you just said, they said that the feedback wasn't really all that helpful outside of the didactics, and often the feedback wasn't specific enough that it actually led to changes in the next go-around of the clerkship. An additional thing that they raised, which I don't know if you struggle with, is that often the students brought up factors that the clerkship directors felt were outside of their control. I'll give you an example. One of the clerkships was rated really poorly, and when you looked at it, it was mostly about the effectiveness of the teaching of the faculty. And the clerkship director said, yeah, we had an awful time in our department. Everyone was burnt out. And it's not that they don't want to teach, it's just they're exhausted. And so that was another one that they raised. And so what I thought was, when I met with them in preparation for this talk, is well, how can I be helpful in sort of figuring out how to make clerkship evaluations better than what they already are? And what I heard from my clerkship directors, that pieces of the outcomes evaluation was working really well, but pieces of a more broader program evaluation weren't working very well. So what I mean by that is that an outcomes evaluation it works really well when you want to see whether something was effective or ineffective. And I know we have experts here on the call, so feel free to chime in. But basically, often what it uses is a taxonomy. Like in medical education, we often use Kirkpatrick hierarchy. And it's best suited for a specific intervention. So let's use Karen's example of didactics. If you're changing the topics of your didactic, an outcomes evaluation works really well. Like, did it work? Were the changes effective? But it doesn't really tell you all that much about why it worked or how it worked. And so sometimes using a different program evaluation model than an outcomes-based evaluation model works better for that. And I'll show you some potential models that you could use that I think work better for something as complex as a clerkship, and allows you to bring up things like, well, I have limited resources. Some of this, although ideal, I can't do. And so doing the cost-benefit ratio that we talked about in the objective slide kind of is worked into the program evaluation. And so here's the chapter. The original chapter divided the clerkship evaluation into 7 different parts. And what I'd like to do is review these different parts, but in the background or with a program evaluation model in mind. So when we're talking about practical issues or specific clerkship components or overall clerkship experiences, let's do that using a program evaluation model and see if that helps you to kind of overcome some of the obstacles that you might have. So before I do that, here's just some examples of program evaluation models. So outcomes evaluation, like the one we talked about with Kirkpatrick's hierarchy, is a program evaluation model. But then if you want to more understand the how and the why, you might want to use one of these other models. And there's tons of them. I just picked 3 that I like, but you certainly can use the one that is more common at your institution. So there's the basic program evaluation model, and I put basic in quotes just because they're not basic, but we call them basic program evaluation models. And 2 of the most commonly used models that I've seen in medical education are the logic model and the CIPP model. We'll pick one just to use, but again, you can use whatever you want. And then you could also use a holistic model. And here I have an example of Haji's model. Whereas the basic models talk about, here are my resources, here are my needs, here's what I actually did and your outcomes. The holistic model just asks you then frame that within a conceptual framework. So this is just a graphic a little bit bigger of Haji's program evaluation model, where you start with your conceptual framework or educational theory about why you think your clerkship, the way you designed it, would work. I don't think that's necessary because we sort of all have a shared mental model about why clerkships work and why they're important, but it is potentially a model that you might like to use. And then once you have the conceptual framework, you think about, well, what are the planned and the emergent or unexpected things that happen, both in when you planned it and in the outcomes, and then that adjusts your theory. But we're going to stick with one of the basic evaluation models, and I picked the CIPP model only because I've seen the logic model a little bit more frequently used in the medical education literature, so I thought we could all learn something by diving into the CIPP model a little bit more. So basically what this model does, very similar to a PDSA cycle, and you certainly could use a PDSA cycle, is you start with your needs, so your context. So this table shows you the potential questions you might ask to fill in each of these portions of the model. So the context model is, what do I need to do? What is useful? And what barriers might I have? What resources do I have? Whereas the input is then, okay, based on my needs and my resources, what are potential ways I could do it? So I could, I could do it with 4 weeks or 2 weeks. And then you sort of think about the cost effectiveness of each of those and you pick one. Once you pick one, then you move on to the process stage. That's sort of, what did you actually do? That's sort of the internal validity if you were in a research project, right? It's like, what did you set out to do and what did you actually do? So how was the program actually implemented? And what activities occurred? Why didn't they occur? So it's a little bit different than a pure outcomes based, because you're not just asking yes or no, you're also asking why and how. And then the product is based on all the previous ones. So you want to know, what are the positive outcomes, the negative outcomes? Did you meet your goals? Were there any unintended consequences? And then you also have to ask, was it effective? Was it sustainable? Was it feasible? Again, coming back to sort of the cost effectiveness ratio, like, yeah, it worked, but wow, it was intensive and we can't do that again. So when I think about that from a clerkship perspective, I was thinking that the contact space would be like your goals and objectives of the clerkship. But you as involved in the planning of the clerkship, you also know your environment better than anyone else. So I would put under context, here are the resources I have. I mean, ideally, I'd like to have every student rotate on every service, but that's just not possible because I don't have the resources. So here are the resources. Here's my clinical learning environment. I know which ones are more suitable for learners and which ones aren't. But you also know the background of your department, of your division, the problems that are going on or things that you're really good at. So you can sort of put the context in your actual clinical learning environment. And that then, based on that, you adjust your goals and objectives. The input is not really the resources. The resources are listed under the context, but the input is, how can I put these resources together? What are some potential sites, ways I could do that? So for example, I have 5 sites. I'm going to have them rotate through all 5 sites, or I'm only going to have them rotate through 2 of them. And so you start planning different ways and you say, well, this one is feasible, that one isn't, and then you pick one. The process is then what actually happened, what actually occurred. Did the didactics that you set out actually happen, or did people cancel because they were too busy? And then the product is not just your outcomes, but also how sustainable it is. So let's go through each of the parts of the chapter and sort of fill in the program evaluation model. But before I do that, any questions about the CIPP model or program evaluation models in general, or anything you guys want to add, since I know we have experts in the group as well? Really, guys are very quiet. All right, so let's start with practical issues. So in the chapter, the practical issues concerning the evaluations were divided into how, and when. And so I thought that we could try to see where do we put these in the CIPP model. So for example, the what is some of the things we already talked about, right? So the what is the objectives and the goals of the clerkship. But what I really liked about the chapter is that you also want to, beyond the objective and goals, sort of take a step back and really think about, what does success look like? Like, what is really the reason we're doing this? What is the impact of my ultimate why? And so it's kind of taking it back, like, yes, I have these specific goals, but really, what does it mean for my clerkship to be successful? A student came through this clerkship and is able to do what? You also have to talk to your stakeholders, right? So you might not be the only one that has influence on objectives and goals, but also like your curricular dean or your senior vice dean of education or your school's deans. They might have things that they want you to add, and we'll do that in one of the examples. And then, of course, LCME requirements. And what resources do you have? That's sort of the what. And in terms of the LCME requirements, I just listed some of the ones. We're about to go through an LCME visit next year. So I've been reviewing these, and I just picked out all the ones that I thought were sort of relevant to this talk. And some of these might not be relevant to you because, for example, the affiliation agreements, that's probably not something that you have to deal with, that the administrative office does. But there are important LCME requirements that as in designing or running or participating in a clerkship, you'll want to pay attention to. So for example, learning objectives. You need to have clear learning objectives, and you need to communicate those to your students, and it has to align with the content that you're teaching. You have to have learner satisfaction, and you need to include assessments, and that includes direct observations, which we'll come back to, as well as giving the students feedback mid-clerkship and giving them both formative and summative evaluation. So these are things that you want to put in your context, right? These are things that you have to do. These are needs. And so when you develop your program evaluation of the clerkship, you want to assess these, but you want to do it in a way that doesn't use all your resources like we talked about. And the how is more resources. So what is available to you? If you're going around eliciting paper evaluations, that's very different than if you have mobile electronic evaluations. Paper, you're not going to do daily because then you have to collect them and you somehow have to watch that they're compliant. But maybe if they're electronic, you could do it more frequently. And do you have the time or the administrative help to make sure that the mid-clerkship feedback happens? Or should that be student initiated? And so the how is sort of thinking about, okay, all my needs, how could I actually pull that off? And then the when is more in the process and product piece, is when do you want to actually collect either learner feedback or other outcomes feedback? Do you want to do that in real time? So do you have student representatives that can give you feedback in real time about specific areas of your clerkship? Do you want to do it right after they finish their clerkship? Do you want to do it maybe a couple weeks down the road when they're already doing another clerkship so they have some comparative, or a combination of those? So as you're designing it and filling out your program evaluation model, you also want to think about the how and the when. Now, the specific components are, what is sort of starts with the input. Now that you know what you have to do, what requirements you have to do, and what resources you have, you start sort of planning what it could look like. Or in your case, how it might be different next year or next rotation than the previous one, because unless you're starting from scratch, you wouldn't do it all, building it from scratch. So there are lots of things to think about in those specific components. There's usually didactics, there's small group sessions, but they're doing the clerkships because they're in the hospital for the first time. So probably the most important is their clinical experience and the fact that they see lots of different kinds of clinical cases, so maybe patient logs. But you might also say, well, in my field, it's really important for them to understand how to do an ultrasound. So you might add to that that's specific to your needs and your background. This is where I would start thinking about what's feasible, right? Because yeah, sure, we would all want to do all of these, but what's the most important? And if I don't have enough faculty or not enough buy-in, which one of these is the ones that is really the most important? And that's where you start putting in your resources. And then you want to think about, well, how am I going to assess whether these happened? So for example, didactics, you could just take attendance, but that's not going to really tell you much about why it did or didn't happen. And so you might start thinking about, okay, well, who can I ask about why a certain didactic or why a certain small group session didn't happen so that I can learn about particular needs. So for example, let's say you planned a didactic for glomerulonephritis, and you happen to run into the faculty member who was supposed to teach that, and they tell you that it didn't happen. And so, if you were just to do a survey or just attendance, all you would know is, yeah, it didn't happen. But now that he's in front of you, you can ask him, well, why didn't it happen? Oh, well, the students had witnessed a code and really needed to debrief about the code. So then you start thinking, okay, well, maybe as part of my clerkship, I need to have something where they can debrief when bad things happen. So as you're designing, well, how am I going to assess the didactics? I would just think about, is there a way to do that that can capture the how and the why, not just yes or no? And then the overall clerkship experience, which was sort of the third part of the chapter, I would start thinking about, the products, what outcomes you want to measure. Did I meet my goals? What were the positive and negative outcomes? But is there anything that happened that I didn't anticipate? So let's say that you decided, because they needed debriefing, you took away something and you added debriefing halfway through the rotation. Well, when you've removed that, whatever it was, glomerulonephritis, did they now have an unintended consequences of no longer understanding glomerulonephritis? And I have no idea why I picked that topic, because I'm not a nephrologist and don't remember glomerulonephritis. But so you want to start thinking about, well, what did my changes do that is unintended? I listed the ones that we always ask about at Penn. So for our course evaluations, we always ask about the overall quality. We ask about the administration, how easy was it to schedule certain things, to fill out your evaluations, the syllabus. We ask about the availability of someone who was supervising you and the quality of instructions. But again, in our end of the program evaluation, we usually just get a number with comments, and those comments may or may not be relevant to us. So we tend to get additional layers of information. But getting back to the original question, we try to get that additional information from things that we're already doing. So if we have a student meeting or a faculty meeting, so for example, when we wanted to learn about the quality of instruction, when there's a monthly faculty meeting, we'll have 5 minutes of time set aside to get feedback from faculty. Says, okay, this didactic didn't happen, why not? Or this didactic went really well, or this topic was really important. So that we, again, not just ask yes, no, but why and how. And then we typically make sure that we meet our LCME requirements, which I'll show you in a second. We do that mostly through external data, as well as administrative data. We don't really check that on course evaluations specifically, but I'll show you how we do that. And then you want to make sure that you actually met your ultimate why. Did you actually meet your goals and objectives? That's the most important thing. I think we tend to forget about that. At least at Penn, we often do. We focus so much on the specifics of the clerkship, we forget to ask about the overall experience and the overall, are our students actually competent in what we wanted them to be competent in? So don't forget to assess that. So in terms of external data, there's sort of 3 different buckets that one is comparable data. So it's not really external, but sometimes it's helpful just to see, is everyone struggling with the same thing? So for example, for our clerkships, the one question that's always rated the lowest is how well the student knew how they were going to be evaluated. And then when you look at it just for your clerkship, you're like, oh, that's strange. I thought it was pretty clear. But then when you look across all clerkships and you see everyone has the same trend, that is helpful, because then you can sort of as a group approach, well, how can we improve that for our students? Shelf exams and the steps certainly can give you some information about the medical knowledge piece and test taking skills. And as you all know, you can look both at the overall score, but also at the individual content areas. And then we get our AAMC graduation questionnaire as one of the many AAMC graduation questionnaire, but you probably know that they do have specific questions about a clerkship on the AAMC graduation questionnaire. We used to ask these questions on our end of course evaluation, but now we just use the graduation questionnaire. So if you're okay with getting feedback about this once a year, then you don't have to do this, and you can wait for the summary of your graduation questionnaire. So I'll show you what they ask for any of you that haven't seen this. So on the graduation questionnaire, they specifically ask about these LCME requirements. So were you observed taking a history? Were you observed doing a physical exam or a mental status exam? And did you receive mid-clerkship feedback? So we don't ask these again unless we hear something that like, oh, by the way, this isn't happening anymore, or something isn't going well. Otherwise, we use our graduation questionnaire to make adjustments each year. The graduation questionnaire also asks about effectiveness of teaching, both of the faculty and the residents. We do ask that again on our evaluations for multiple reasons. One, that can change that at a moment's time. So that's probably not enough to get that once a year, and for graduation requirements for the residents and promotion requirements for the faculty. The AAMC questionnaire also asks about mistreatment. So it asks whether the student either observed or felt any mistreatment during the clerkship, and that'll give you a breakdown specifically by the clerkship, and then it'll ask by who it was that they felt was mistreating them or observed them, and it asks about specifically if it was faculty in the classroom, faculty in the clinical setting. So that might be something that you don't additionally have to evaluate. You could use your graduation questionnaire, although I think most of us have a way that students report mistreatment at our institution. So we also no longer ask that on our program evaluations because we receive data directly from where they report it at the institution. Any questions about any of that before we try to fill out a program evaluation model, or any comments? I'm not going to give up. I'll keep trying. All right, so let's imagine that we are a clerkship that covers all of our different departments. And so I purposely tried to have this not be too specific, but I told you I'm a pulmonologist, so I apologize if this seems like medicine and not like your department. But let's pretend that our, we have lots of different things that we want them to learn, but we're going to focus on, on our clerkship, we really want them to apply their knowledge, their basic knowledge of common diseases. They're just starting out in the clinics, so we're not going to go with rare diseases. We're going to start with common illnesses. And we want them to be able to take a history around those common illnesses, and they have to have strong communication skills. So we know already that somehow we need to assess whether we met those goals, right? So we need to make sure that not only do they have the basic knowledge, but they know how to apply them, and they know they need to have strong communication skills. So when we come to the program evaluation piece, we need to make sure that we adjust, that we measure for these three things. But we also talked to our dean, and our dean really loves all the research we've been doing on novel treatments of common illnesses. So even though that wasn't one of our objectives, we're going to have to somehow incorporate that because the dean really wants us to do that. So now we need to add that. We probably don't care as much about this because this wasn't our objective, but we need to make sure it was just done. So this might just be, okay, here, yes, no is enough. Like this could be a purely outcomes based, doesn't have to be a why or how. And then we already reviewed the LCME requirements. We got to make sure that we give them feedback, that we assess them, that they're directly observed, and that we give them grades on time. And then you want to start thinking about your resources. So for our made up clerkship, let's say we have 3 clinical sites, but we only have 10 teachers. 8 of these are outpatient and 2 of them are inpatient. So one of those inpatient faculty covers 2 clinical sites. So we already know, okay, even though I have 2 inpatient faculty, it's really just 1 because that 1 doesn't have any time to do anything. We only have 1 conference room and it's right next to the clinic. And so the inpatient folks say there's no way, we're too busy, we can't come over there. But the outpatient faculty all say, yeah, we'd love to teach and we will come over to the conference room. So even though that's resources and should be under context, I put it under input because now we can play around with this and come up with lots of different ways that we could make this work. But let's say we picked one that was like 4 weeks. They're going to do 3 weeks as outpatient because the inpatient faculty are so busy, and they're going to do 1 week inpatient. And we're going to ask them to be directly observed every day by faculty, and the student is responsible for that. They have to fill that out. And that also counts as their patient log. And we're going to use that to make sure that our process actually happened, because we're going to look at those patient logs and see whether it actually happened. And then we'll have our administrative team make sure that they meet with the clerkship director every 2 weeks. So that's what we set out to do. And, it never goes like we plan. So the process is now, well, what actually happened? So who can you ask? You can ask your students, you can ask your faculty, you can look at the patient logs. Coming back to like the cost effectiveness, I would like, how can you figure out what happened without having to have a lot of extra work? So like you have the patient logs, so you can get a lot of information from that, like were they actually directly observed? And what kind of patients did they see? Is there enough variety that would inform future didactics? Or like I mentioned at a faculty meeting, you could ask, like, how did it go? And so let's say we ask our faculty, and the outpatient faculty say, yeah, it went pretty well. They showed up and they worked with one of us every day, but we rotated. So we probably each saw the student once or twice in the 3 weeks, maybe 3 times. We directly observed them probably once a day, maybe once every other day, but they really logged their patients. And yeah, we made it to the lunch didactics, but we didn't end up talking about glomerulonephritis because we didn't think that was necessary. But on the inpatient side, the attendings tell you that, you know what, we didn't have time to observe them. It didn't happen. But the students did do their logs. They did their write-up, but we didn't have time to grade them. And they didn't make it. We didn't make it to the lunch didactics, so we don't know if the students went. So you're already getting feedback and you already know what worked, what doesn't work, without having to do any surveys. That might help you for future rotations. You know whether or not the clerkship director meetings happened. You can even ask during one of those clerkship directors, what didactics, how are they going? Like nothing that would make the student feel uncomfortable and about potentially affecting their grade, but like just getting feedback about the didactics. Like you could ask some questions while they're there. And then you will look at the faculty evaluations and resident evaluations, and you realize that no one filled them out. So that's something that you're going to have to focus on next time. Like, how can you make that happen? You look at the patient log, and you look at the shelf exams, and I'm sure you guys can look at other things that in terms of the process. The one thing I wanted to just mention when we talk about process is to think about equity. This is not a talk about how to assess the student, but the context equity is an important piece when you're trying to design your clerkship or assessing your clerkship. And so I just wanted to briefly mention, I really like this graphic from academic medicine paper in 2020 about the assessment outcomes and inequities in the process of assessment. And they divide the portions into three. So there's intrinsic design of the assessment, which really relates to the actual, like, when are you assessing students and what's the instrument like? There's the context. So that's the fairness in the learning environment. And basically when you're thinking about the process, you want to make sure that the environments that you're exposing your students to allow them to perform at their best. And that any differences or variations that you see isn't because of the learning environment, but truly because of the student performance. And then instrumental use of the assessment is sort of how you use the results of that assessment. Again, I'm not going to talk about this in depth, but I think the intrinsic design of the assessment piece is almost the easiest piece, but the one that we always focus on. And that's sort of like, do we have a shared mental model of what competency looks like? You already did this in your program evaluation model because you thought about what does success look like. But the evaluation instrument itself, you want to make sure that what is the language like? Is the language gendered? Does it actually measure what you want it to measure? There we have criteria that we use. So we have, validity, reproducibility, and so on. But the context equity is an important piece that you want to make sure in your program evaluation model you somehow measure. We have in our example, we have 3 different clinical sites, but within those sites, they might be on different floors. They might be on different clinics. They might be working, there on a Monday instead of a Friday, and everyone's grumpy on a Monday and everyone's happy on a Friday, or on Monday, there was no coffee left, or the coffee wasn't ready yet. So everyone was grumpy. And then there's, who they work with, and did they get basically, is the clinical environment supporting them to learn and to perform at their best. So just think about that. It's like, when we ask about the process, what actually happened, are there differences on site, or is there any other differences you can think of that would be important to know about? And then I'll just briefly mention instrumental use of the assessment. So if you're the clerkship director, you're the one assigning grades. So as part of your process, you might think about that to make sure that you're counting for potential inequities. So for example, if you designed your faculty evaluations to truly measure whether someone was minimally competent, but now you're using them to assign honors, that's different than what you intended the instrument to do. And does that potentially introduce bias in some way? My favorite is always the examinations of medical knowledge, because they seem like they're the easiest thing to do because we already have tests, but we tend to then over measure medical knowledge because the faculty also often comment on medical knowledge, and we may forget about the communication skills or the application skills that were part of our objectives. And so we might introduce bias there as well. So again, it's not a talk about assessment. I just wanted to bring that up because in our process piece, we want to make sure that, for example, in our 3 weeks on the outpatient side, that they each rotated with different faculty members, and there weren't one person was always in one clinic and one person in another, and there were significant differences in the learning environment that we need to know about. So when you're thinking about that, can you ask your faculty or your students about, were there any clinical environment differences? I was going to have you tell me, like, now, based on the resources that we have, what are your outcomes that you want to measure, your products? I'm a little nervous you guys aren't going to say anything, but I'm going to ask anyway. So now that we've developed this clerkship, or thinking about your clerkship, in addition to some of the things we already mentioned, what would you want to see in the product piece?
Well, we always try to find out how they did during internship. So we query our internship program directors. We get about an 85% response rate. Were they ready or not?
Yeah, that's great. And that sort of gets to the ultimate why that we always forget about, right? Like, ultimately what we want to know, are we preparing them to be independent physicians or good interns? And so that is an important outcome. How do they actually do? Did we actually help them? And now we can see the reporting milestones from the ACGME from our graduates. As long as we have 100% consent from the students, then we can see them. Anything else you guys would want to see?
I think that prior to graduation, you would want to observe students maybe in the last 6 months of their med school time to make sure they actually have those communication skills you're talking about. Some direct observation, because if they didn't have those before they graduated, we'd probably drop dead with embarrassment.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think another important point there is not just that we want to ask about our objectives, but we want to make sure that we measure that again not just during our clerkship, but following our clerkship, to make sure that they're ready to graduate and have the skills that we want them to have.
One thing that we've been doing, we're introducing this year, is bringing back OSCEs at the end of the clerkship to sort of evaluate some of our key objectives around communication skills, some physical exam, and some sort of interpreting labs, trying to have very specifics in our OSCEs. I'm not sure how it will go, but we'll see.
Yeah, that's great. We also do that at the end of our clerkship year. So during each clerkship, they have OSCEs that they have to pass that meet the competencies of that particular clerkship. But at the end of the full year of clerkships, they have another OSCE that is 12 cases. And we reassess the most important, the skills that we think they need to have in order to graduate or move on to electives. And one of the things that I particularly like about that is it seems to, even though I was nervous about it because it's one day in time, and what if they had a bad day? But we've actually seen fewer inequities compared to some of our other grading. So it's not the only thing we use. We also look at feedback from program directors and reporting milestones and internship, but it does seem to give us a really nice view into their competencies. Anything else you guys are doing that others could learn from? All right. Well, so some of the things, I'm sorry, go ahead.
This is Lou Pangaro. Our school is a little different. You know, we're the military medical school, and we have an exercise in the 4th year that all the students must participate in, where they have a simulated battlefield environment and they have to demonstrate their skill as somebody who can triage a patient, somebody who can communicate and run a team. So there are various kinds of exercises in this Bushmaster exercise. Otherwise, they don't get to graduate. It's very practical. It's like a simulated a catastrophe, and they have to have 2 or 3 different roles on it. It's still a simulation, and they're prepared for it over the prior 4 years. But for us, it's kind of a capstone assessment prior to graduation. Over. And it doesn't matter whether you're going into medicine, psychiatry, or surgery. It's the same exercise for everybody. Over. That's
great. Anybody else do something like that? Sort of right before they graduate?
This is done in the fall of the 4th year, so that if there's a problem, we can fix it.
Oh, of course. Yeah, good point. Really like the things that have been brought up, because often what I see is that we're very heavy in our program evaluation of learner satisfaction, and learner satisfaction is very important, but isn't enough to ensure that we're meeting our competencies and our objectives in our clerkship. So I like the examples you brought up, because we're getting tests about how they're actually doing that aren't only focused on medical knowledge, but really about all the competencies that we care about. And so that I like the examples a lot. So I listed all the ones that I commonly hear about, and then wanted to brainstorm with you about ones that might actually matter more. And so thank you for sharing that. Now what we actually do for the clerkships is we do the program evaluation piece with them. And so I'll jump back to that. So basically, what if you were to use one of these program evaluation models? It's very similar to a PDSA cycle, where you start as you get information back about the process and the product. Like, let's say that in this OSCE, they aren't showing the communication skills we want them to have, then, that feedback, obviously you're going to redesign your clerkship and the cycle starts over. And so what we do for them now is we'll have learner satisfaction, but we get all the other information that we just talked about. We have the OSCE that's for each rotation, but we also have the OSCE at the end of the clerkships. We have how they do on their sub-I. We have how they do an internship. We get feedback from their program directors. So what we do for our course directors, our clerkship directors, is we get all that data. We get feedback from them. What do you think has worked well? What didn't work well? And any changes in your environment or in your resources that we need to know about. And then we review all of that. And we say, based on what we see, we think you might need more administrative help here, or you might want to make these changes. And then we have a conversation with the clerkship directors involved in all this, and so are the students. And so then we just do this on an annual basis. As information comes in, we review them and we do this cycle over and over. And we make adjustments accordingly. And honestly, what we found is that most clerkships struggle with the same thing. So although it felt wrong to do this with them, for them, it actually has been really helpful, because then we can find solutions that work for across the clerkships and not just with one clerkship. The one other piece that we look at is not just the process and the outcome and the ultimate why, but really the feasibility. And so, if we're asking them to collect all this information, is that really feasible? And is there a way that we can substitute that from something that we're already measuring? Or is there potentially something that we can measure that is sort of a marker of that, rather than having the clerkship directors have additional work? And I was talking to a few people at a different institution. We were sort of talking about the program evaluation piece, and at UConn, they said, we like this PDSA kind of cycle, but it was just too much work. And so basically their approach was to just make sure that you have more than one layer in your program evaluation, so that we don't only rely on student satisfaction scores, but we have at least two others. So ideally all five. So one being, you could have focus groups with students and ask about the why, like, why did something work? Why didn't something work? You can get feedback from the faculty about why something did or didn't happen. The course director, of course, has to be involved, because the course director understands the environment and understands the resources better than anybody. And then having that comparative piece, both in comparisons of how did the clerkship do this year compared to last year, but also between courses, can be helpful to figure out ways to do the program evaluation without adding more cost to an individual clerkship. So my biggest takeaways are really that, we are so heavily focused on outcomes evaluation, which I think is incredibly important, especially in the ultimate why, right? We just talked about this. We want to make sure that they actually met their competencies, but that the program evaluation model just remind you to also look at, other than did something work or didn't work, understanding why it worked, and understanding the effects of being in a clinical learning environment, like in a hospital. and I already said this, but that learner satisfaction is incredibly important for program evaluation, but is not the only component of program evaluation. So sort of thinking about, are there other ways you could get feedback about why something is or isn't working? Do you all have any questions about that? I'm going to stop sharing so I can see you. What do you guys think?
Well, I'm still here and willing to talk. I like, Jessica, the fact that one of the ways you figure out whether things are working is you talk to people. The role of actual conversation from people who are doing the work, teachers or students. The role of conversation is essential to the communication process. It can't all be on a cell phone or through surveys or things. I thought that was helpful.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's an essential part, the conversation piece. And even the N is smaller, but you get rich information. And when you combine it with other information, it's incredibly important.
We know in the area of evaluating students, teachers will tell you what they won't write down.
Yes.
So it also makes sense that students will tell you what they won't write down, and faculty will tell you about your program what they won't write down.
Yeah, we actually just recently piloted not for our clerkships, but for our pre-clerkship courses, a different model for course evaluation, because we looked at the number of surveys that our evaluations that our students have to fill out, and it was just ridiculous. And at one point I looked and they had over 2,000 evaluations that they had to complete over 1 year. And so what we did instead is we randomly selected a subset of students to have focus groups halfway through and at the end, and just give us feedback. And we did the usual and the new format, and the students gave really rich feedback in the focus groups. So they were able to say at the end, we didn't like this lecture of acid base when we first had it. And so we would have rated it really low if you would have given us an evaluation form at the time. But at the end of the course, it all came together. And now we understand why we had to have that particular lecture in the beginning. They were really thoughtful about that. And so what they, one of the specific feedback that they give is, maybe can you just label that, like, this isn't going to make sense right now, but you need to learn the terminology, and then we'll come back to it later. And the course directors felt that the focus groups were really helpful for them, both to implement specific changes for next year.
Who did you have run the focus groups?
The course reps. So we have, I think we have 5 course reps, and they usually meet once a week. And so we held the focus group during one of the course rep meetings twice, and had one of them come out, and we trained them on how to lead focus groups so that the students felt comfortable speaking. We're piloting it again because the course rep that volunteered the first time is a superstar. So we'll see now that we're going to use different, we'll see if it's still as effective, but I can let you know when we pilot it again.
So the course reps are faculty?
They're students, sorry.
So this is all student run.
Say that again?
So it's all student run?
Yep, totally student run. So I trained them in how to run a focus group. We came up with a moderator guide together. And basically what we did is we had them sort of chat with their colleagues just to see like what's going on. And then based on what we heard, and we were doing the usual evaluation at the same time. So we collected themes, and then we just asked more in-depth questions about it. So like, tell us about why this didn't go well or why this didn't go well. Well, we started with broad questions. And then the student filled out, like the student summarized the focus group, wrote up a report, and we gave the course directors what the students did and what we would normally give them. And we asked them like which one was more helpful. And the course directors thought that overall it wasn't a huge difference, but the students gave more specific feedback. The students loved the focus groups. They thought it was one, they called it jury duty. Like if they knew they had to do this a few times throughout the year, that was better than having to fill out 2,000 evaluations. So ultimately, I think it wasn't a huge gain, but it was a small gain with a significant reduction in the number of evaluations they had to fill out. Any other questions or comments?
So really
Thank
appreciate you taking the time to do this. I mean, it's like Dr. Pangaro said, it's important to have communication with people, and I like the fact that you pointed out that these evaluations need to be multifactorial and get a lot of different viewpoints in a lot of different ways to make it meaningful. So thank you, and thank everybody for coming today.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. It's good to see all of you. I recognize some names. Thank you.